Thank you, Dr. Gerstenfeld, and thank you, of course, to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for organizing this conference. I am very glad to be here. It's always good to find an excuse to come to Jerusalem. On my way to Jerusalem, I asked myself whether this conference could be organized today in a prestigious European university. I had the great honor to teach in one such institution for 8 years. And so I asked myself, could I organize one conference if I was still there? One conference like this one. And the answer, after some thinking, was yes, I could. Of course, the difference would be that I would have to invite approximately, as half of the participants, people who would question Israel's legal and historical rights in order to get the authorization and clearance to organize one such forum. And I think that if I try to imagine the lineup of academics coming, probably all of them, most of them, if not all of them, would be Jewish. Half of them would be Israeli. Let me give you an example. I'm not just being funny. In January 2005, a very prestigious debating society organized in London a debate where the motion was, this House believes that Zionism today is the worst enemy of the Jews. I'll leave it to you to guess whether the motion passed or lost, and by which margins. But let me tell you what the lineup was. 3 in favor, 3 against. The 3 in favor of the motion were Professor Avi Schleim, Professor Jacqueline Rose, and journalist Amira Hass. So depending on how you define Israeli, it's either 2 Israelis and 1 Jew, or 1 ex-Israeli, 1 Israeli and 1 Jew. Against the motion, Melanie Phillips, Rafi Israeli, and Shlomo Ben-Ami. So here you had 3 or 4 Israelis, depending how you count, and 2 or 3 members of the British Jewish community arguing in favor and against the motion, Israel is the worst enemy, Zionism is the worst enemy of the Jews, in front of approximately 1,000 members of the Greater London community. This is by no means an exception. The debates that were mentioned before by Ambassador Gold at the Oxford Union, several others at Cambridge and in other places, all featured similar lineups. It's always a group of Jewish intellectuals, Israeli intellectuals, being brought forth, given a platform to provide a very strong case against Israel's right to exist. Not criticize Israel or its policies or this policy or that policy, but to question and undermine Israel's right to exist. And indeed, in the acrimonious debate that accompanies the Middle East, in Europe, those who reject accusations of anti-Semitism, even in those extreme circumstances where anti-Semitism is plain for all to see, for example, the comparison of Israel to Nazis, the use of the imagery of the blood libel, or the description of Israelis as Christ killers in order to comment on events in the conflict. People who reject this accusation, I was saying, often use 2 discursive techniques to fend off criticism. First, they dismiss accusation of anti-Semitism as blackmail, and go on, and that's the second technique, they go on to rely on Jewish anti-Zionists as proof that their hostility is discerning, not against all Jews, but only against those Jews who dare to support Israel's right to exist. They often cite them as the sources of their information and frequently produce their rhetoric and their writings as evidence of Jews arguing much the same against Israel. And they claim that given such company and such similarity of discourse, they can hardly be accused of anti-Semitism. If Jews say it, it must be kosher. And so central to this argument is the rhetoric that some anti-Zionist Jews espouse about the Jewish morality of opposing Israel, the need to voice opposition to Israel and its very existence in the name of Jewish values, which in effect provides succor to anti-Israel rhetoric. This rhetoric, interestingly enough, and I think this is the new element of our current discourse, is that it is a discourse about saving the Jews from themselves. It is a salvation that depends on ending Zionism and its consequences. And it is therefore, for all intents and purposes, a linguistic mandate to destroy the Jewish state articulated by Jews in the name of Jewish values and for the sake of the Jewish people. So I said the first part of the argument dismisses accusation of anti-Semitism by insinuating that they're used as a form of blackmail to silence all criticism of Israel. Think of Walter Mearsheimer, for example. Think of Jimmy Carter. And the second technique, of course, follows from the first. Once Jews are discredited for their alleged attempts to gag critics of Israel, Jewish intellectuals are then brought in to endorse such hateful rhetoric and substance, and they're cited basically as the alibi against accusation of anti-Semitism. Now, this is not always mentioned, but many detractors of Israel will seek validation for statements that would be particularly offensive to Jews by invoking a Jewish or an Israeli source, putting the emphasis on the ethnic or religious origin of that source rather than the merit of its argument. A Jew or an Israeli, this logic goes, somehow sterilizes the statement, makes it kosher, makes it legitimate. I mentioned Walter Mearsheimer. There are many examples. In England, for example, there are two frequent commentators of the conflict, John Pilger, who perhaps is a more extreme example, but Anatol Lieven, frequent Financial Times columnist, who has in the past evoked the, I quote, iron grip of the Jewish lobby, end of quote, over U.S. foreign policy and its alleged ability to stifle public debate, and always mentions the Jewish ancestry of people who disagrees with him to delegitimize their argument, and the Jewish ancestry of people who would agree with him in order to strengthen the argument. And these are not exceptions. Accusations of Zionist influence, of Zionist control, of Zionist conspiracies are usually accompanied by strong disclaimers on anti-Semitism that tend to invoke Jews, usually anti-Israel and anti-Zionist Jews, as proof and alibi for such views. And there are Jewish intellectuals who indeed comply with this call and offer themselves as a shield against accusations, thereby providing the kind of defense that anti-Semites need in a world where anti-Semitism has been banned from acceptable social and political discourse in order to hate the Jews without the stigma attached to prejudice and actually in the name of a legitimate, commendable moral crusade for justice and peace in the region. Alan Hart, British journalist, for example, reminds us in the introduction of a book called Zionism, the Worst Enemy of the Jews, that, quote, all of the most perceptive and the most devastating of Zionism critics were and are Jews. And if this is the case, of course, then the worst type of rhetoric against Israel can never be anti-Semitic, because Jews themselves have voiced it. And there is a further step in this process that turns anti-Semitic discourse into acceptable language, thanks to the alibi provided by Jews endorsing such rhetoric. And that is that any attempt to expose this discourse as anti-Semitic is instantly dismissed because it is presented an apology of Israel, which, according to the promoters of this argument, is indefensible. Israel and its founding ideology, Zionism, are presented not just as a threat to peace in the region, they're presented as a threat to world peace. They're also accused to hurt the Jews, the Jewish people first and foremost. The depiction of Israel as evil is presented as truth, and asking, therefore, as a consequence, that Jews distance themselves from evil is seen as an attempt to save them from abuse, the abuse of anti-Semitism, which derives not from prejudice, but supposedly from attachment to and sympathy for Israel. Just give you a few examples. Justin Keating, Irish intellectual, wrote in 2005 the following, quote, "Jews have made an immense contribution to civilization." Thank you very much. "Developing as they were between the great empires of Mesopotamia and the Nile, with both of which they had intimate contact and by which they wanted to avoid being swallowed. They developed a religion and an ethos based on independence, liberty, and democracy for which we all owe a debt." That was the past. "That religion is based on the twin concepts of law and righteousness, which inspired over the millennia extraordinary contributions to culture and morality." All admirable. In Israel-Palestine, where are they now? Zionists have betrayed all of this, and that is a tragedy, not just for Jews, but for all of us. End of quote. So Zionism is depicted as a betrayal of Judaism, which invites anti-Semitism on account of its actions. Jews would do better to denounce it and become responsible for their own suffering in their failure to do so. And of course, this kind of rhetoric is endorsed and gravitates around the idea of what it means to be Jewish in today's world, and it is fed into by both Jews and non-Jews. And I'm going to give you a few examples. Max Hastings, conservative commentator in Great Britain, wrote in 2006 the following words, quote, "Younger Europeans, not to mention the rest of the world, are more skeptical about Israel's territorial claims. They're less susceptible to moral arguments about redress for past horrors, which have underpinned Israeli actions for almost 60 years. We may hope that it will never become respectable to be anti-Semitic. However, Israel is discovering that it can no longer frighten non-Jews out of opposing its policies merely by accusing them of anti-Semitism." There's a stark logic that follows from his and similar language. If Jews refuse to oppose Israel's policies, they will pay a price. 2 more minutes, thank you. And far from expressing a prejudice, these advocates of Jewish self-indictment are actually persuaded that to say so is for the welfare of the Jews. Let me give you a few examples. October 2001, Barbara Spinelli, a frequent commentator in the Italian third daily newspaper La Stampa, who defined Israel as ultra-nationalist and called it a scandal. A scandal, of course, first and foremost for the Jews, given that, as any European would know, the Jews are deemed to be the ultimate victims of modern nationalism. And it follows that, therefore, the Jews have a special duty to denounce Israel, defend the victims of Israel, and do so in public, lest they're suspected of complicity. And she writes, quote, "If there is one thing missing in Judaism, it's precisely this, a mea culpa, vis-à-vis populations and individuals who had to pay a price of blood and exile to let Israel exist." And she then proceeds to invite world Jewry to make an immediate public amend. Quote, "If the initiative does not begin in Jerusalem, then it should at least with the diaspora, where so many Jews experience a double and conflicting loyalty. To Israel and to the state they belong to and where they vote. A solemn mea culpa proclaimed by Jewish community dispersed across the West, that will stand by the West and will keep its ramparts, that will invite Israel's leaders to bring an end to abusive occupations, that will rebuild a religion that is not identified anymore with exalting the colonial state and the superiority of a people. All this could be an important start, beneficial even to the nation of Israel." I have plenty of other examples where Israel is called upon to convert, where Israel is accused of original sin. Remember, original sin is a Catholic Christian concept that means something that comes with birth and can be only washed away by embracing salvation through baptism. So how do you baptize Israel? By renouncing Zionism, and so on. There's plenty of examples, and all the time, Jewish intellectuals, Jewish scholars, Jewish spokespeople are invited to endorse this view and denounce Israel. And this function, which by no means is a majority trend within Jewish communities across the world, but it is significant among intellectuals, has become central to the discourse in the Western world that tries to delegitimize Israel, to separate Israel from the Jewish people, and to present Israel not just as an evil because of its supposedly terrible actions within the context of the Middle East, but also as the worst possible betrayal of Jewish authenticity It is an attempt to reclaim Jewish identity as something completely devoid of a Jewish national identity, completely detached from the land of Israel, completely eradicated from anything else but a secular, post-nationalist, anti-Zionist understanding of Jewish identity. Thank you.